Hello, my name is Alison Sharrock and I'm Professor of Classics at the University of Manchester. This is a brief revision lecture for the Imperial Image section of the Classical Civilization A-Level. And I'm going to look in particular at the Ovid Metamorphoses and the diui filius element in the Augustan image. So, what you've got in this passage from Ovid's Metamorphoses is the very end of a 15-book epic. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. If we just look at what is in this section, you could say it's the assassination and deification of Julius Caesar, it's a comparison between Caesar and Augustus, then the projected deification of Augustus, and finally the transmogrification of Ovid himself into his poetry. It's an excellent passage for thinking about the notion of the divi filius, the son of a god, and Augustan propaganda. But it's also a very useful passage, I think, for thinking about, as the specification requires, ways in which classical texts might be interpreted by different readers or audiences, both ancient and modern. Now, you could go through these lines, picking out all kinds of places where Ovid officially, publicly, toes the party line about Augustus's leadership, about his role in the civil wars, his role as avenger, with the gods on his side, and we have Jupiter himself assuring us that the gods are on Augustus's side, about the marriage reforms and the religious reforms, and even about the succession to Tiberius, cleverly described as the offspring of Augustus's holy wife, which makes it sound like it's Augustus's own son, which of course it isn't. All sorts of ways in which you could read this as fitting exactly with the expectations of Augustan propaganda. But you could also read it very differently. And I certainly want to read it very differently. I think it is exceptionally likely that at least some people in Ovid's own time read it as quite different from that kind of party line interpretation which I've given you. Let's have a look at some of the ways in which we might want to read it differently. Let's take this son of a god idea first. The diui filius, known to be promoted by Augustus, but he's quite careful about not being deified in his own lifetime, and very much associating it with Roman ideas about piety to parents and so on. But let's have a look at what Ovid actually says about it. If we consider the passage at lines 750 to 8, we get this. Get it introduced as how could anyone think that all those amazing achievements of Julius Caesar as a Roman general, all his great triumphs over the world, and Ovid goes through various places that he has done these enormous triumphs, they are nothing compared with being the father of so great a man, and indeed of engendering. The Latin word genuisse is a very biological word, so great a man. So that's kind of absurd to start with, that comparison. And then the whole idea of deification is brought about as being something that is absolutely planned. Yes, planned by Venus and Jupiter, but also planned by Augustus. And so this is at line 760 to 761. So that Augustus should not be born from mortal seed, literally again seed, very biological terminology, Julius needed to be made a god. He needed to be faciendus, deus faciendus, a god needing to be made a god. Okay, these are absurd exaggerations. And they're made even more absurd by the way that it is described as, Julius Caesar's deification is being described as something that doesn't come about by his great deeds. That's the standard euhemeristic idea of the human being who becomes a god because of his great benefactions to the world. I mean, like Hercules becoming a god as a result of his labours and so on. It's not those great things. It's being the father of Augustus, Octavian and Augustus. And the problem with that, of course, is at least partly that it is both of these elements, both being a father and being a god, are retrospective, and they are artificial. It needs to be made a god. He is made a god by Augustus's decree, and he's only made Augustus's father by adoption. Now, of course, adoption is a big part of Roman, particularly Roman aristocratic family, and indeed also political activity. Absolutely, there's nothing odd about that. But what is odd is giving this very biological presentation of it with words like engender, the genuisse, the Latin word, and from the seed, semine cretus, so created from the seed, obviously where we get the word semen from in English. And all this is coming from Ovid, that master of disguise, deception, and artificiality. It's as if he's sort of saying, well, Augustus is making him a god in this kind of artificial way, the rather deceptive and clever way that Ovid himself works with poetry. Also important for looking at how an ancient audience would come at this passage is, and this is very important to remember, that an ancient audience coming at this passage is coming at it with a very different background from the way you're coming at it. You're coming at it as a little chunk, as part of a discussion of the imperial image. That's absolutely a valid way to be looking at this passage of text. But it will shape it in a certain way. For the original reader, and indeed for a modern reader who is reading the whole poem, there's a number of things that's going to make it quite different. You'll be approaching this from the bigger context of this 15-book epic poem. It's a large, substantial work, and epic is the great genre of the highest kind of literature in the Roman culture. But what's this poem about? Well, perhaps you have already looked at a few other little bits to get a bit of a comparison. It'd be a lovely thing to do if you can look at some of the other parts. We've got 15 books of stories of metamorphosis, of things turning into other things. But it's not just that, it's also a whole history of the world. From the first beginnings, the earliest parts of the poem are about creation and how matter comes into being and gets to change and be differentiated. And it goes all the way through human history. But within that, we have an awful lot of stories, some of them distinctly disreputable, including some extremely bad behaviour on the part of Jupiter, king of the gods, and lots of people turning into different things, or being turned, usually by either by the action of the gods, or sometimes it's not clear what turns them into other things. they might turn into trees or animals or birds or rocks. And turning into gods is one of those types of metamorphosis. It is something that we can actually see growing through the later part of the poem, right back from Hercules, through the deification of Aeneas, of Romulus, then of Aesculapius, which is the passage just before your passage starts, which is about the transfer of the god Asclepius, you might know him better as, a healing god, brought to Tiber Island in Rome, transferred to the Roman world to deal with a plague. And then we go into Julius Caesar and his deification, and that's your passage. So we've got this kind of great movement of deification, of apotheosis. But that is only one kind of metamorphosis that the poem has. What's interesting about it is that it is almost the only positive experience of metamorphosis. It's also almost the only male-dominated experience of metamorphosis. Most metamorphosis is actually of females and is painful and destructive to their person, their body often, sometimes not the mind. There's a whole huge area to talk about there, for which there is not room in this little revision lecture about the end of the poem. But it is important to see apotheosis, deification, becoming a god, as part of this whole story of metamorphosis. And one of the ways, among the ways that it's important to see it, in many ways, but among them, is that little bit on the end. Don't ignore that some people call it the epilogue, the part after the projected deification of Augustus, when Ovid talks about himself and his own projected sublimation, apotheosis in some sense, to the final word of the poem, which is vivam, I shall live. One word in Latin, I shall live, which we, every time we read the poem, make to be true. Because he has become his poetry, he is living through our reading of it. There is a sense in which, after the move to the deification of Augustus, the projected deification of Augustus, it is actually topped by the apotheosis of Ovid himself and his transfer into his everlasting poetry. And you can see that in many ways, but in one nice little detail, the final word of the description of Augustus is absens, absent, that he will be a god who will help from afar, absens. And then that matches that I shall live with which the poem actually ends, as if Ovid has trumped Augustus and overcome him. And that, I think, is also important in understanding the poem as a whole, and understanding what might be happening in this passage. One more thing about seeing this passage within the poem as a whole. This is an epic. Epic has a strong teleological drive. Now, if you've studied the Aeneid already, you will perhaps have seen this in action, and you will see how the Aeneid is directed towards coming to Italy, the foundation of Rome, and indeed beyond the end of the poem into the actual foundation of Rome, which of course doesn't actually happen within the poem, and ultimately to eternal Rome, and indeed also to Augustus. So it's got a very strong drive all the way through that gets physical form, in a sense, in its journey from, or the journey of Aeneas from Troy to Proto-Rome, to Lavinium, what will become Rome. A teleological drive is an essential part of an epic, and that's happening in the Metamorphoses also. Right at the beginning of the poem, Ovid said that he was going to tell the story of the world from its first beginnings to my own times. And so he does. Now, at one level, you could say, if you really wanted to take the Augustan official line, if you want to toe that Augustan official line, the great telos, the great goal of the poem is Augustus. And that's what it's all working its way towards. And that final apotheosis of Augustus is the great telos of the poem. Except that we've got the epilogue coming after it. And it's really the epilogue that answers the opening of the poem. It's Ovid himself, Ovid's poetry, which is going to be the true end of the poem. And Ovid's poetry is something which the anger of Jupiter cannot destroy. So, the one final thing that I'm going to say about this passage is this. Jupiter is associated with Augustus in a number of places in this poem. He is associated with Augustus in this final scene, as you can see, and is actually explicitly compared Augustus and Julius to Jupiter and Saturn. It's a little strange when we think of that relationship. Never mind. There it is. The great things compared with great things. But right back in Book 1, there was a description of Jupiter's house in the Milky Way, and it is described as being like the Palatine and the house of Augustus. There are a number of ways in which Jupiter and Augustus are closely associated in the Metamorphoses in a way that they're not in the Aeneid. Jupiter is absolutely on Aeneas' side in the Aeneid, but he's not closely associated with him. In the Metamorphoses, he's not closely associated as in identified with him. In the Metamorphoses, the Jupiter of the Metamorphoses is much closer to Augustus. And indeed in Ovid's exile poetry later again, that's made quite explicit, the connection between Jupiter and Augustus. And the Jupiter of the Metamorphoses is not exactly a character that you would want to regard as the most honourable, not exactly the character that you would want to compare yourself with if you wanted to praise somebody. So, for all these reasons, what I'm offering you here is an interpretation of your passage which sees it as officially towing the party line and contributing to Augustus's propaganda, but sowing the seeds of its own undoing all the way through.